When they finally removed her clothes after death, what they found beneath 44 years of elaborate costume made them seal her body in a lead coffin within hours. 7 words from a Spanish diplomat ended his career. Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly what he meant and why her tomb has stayed locked for over 400 years. Picture this. A trained Spanish diplomat, a man who had observed hundreds of European queens and princesses with professional precision, sits down to write an encrypted dispatch to King Philip II of Spain. His hand trembles slightly as he pens 7 words that will end his diplomatic career. Her Majesty's form is not as other women's. Read that again carefully. This wasn't a poetic description or a compliment about her regal bearing. This was a professional observation so disturbing, so fundamentally wrong, that it had to be written in code and sent directly to the Spanish king. Within days of that letter reaching Madrid, the diplomat was recalled from England. He was never given another foreign posting. He was never allowed to elaborate on what he meant. Those 7 words were all he managed to get out before someone in power made absolutely certain he would never speak of Elizabeth's body again. What did he see? What physical reality was so obvious to a trained observer that it shocked him enough to risk his career reporting it? The answer lies in a pattern of observations that would haunt Elizabeth for her entire reign. These diplomats weren't casual observers making offhand comments at social gatherings. They were intelligence gatherers, trained from youth to notice the smallest details, to read body language with the precision of a surgeon, to assess the physical and mental capabilities of foreign rulers with cold analytical precision. They had spent years at various European courts observing queens, princesses, duchesses, and noblewomen of every rank and station. They knew exactly what a woman's body looked like, how it moved through space, how it was proportioned, what distinguished one individual from another while maintaining the fundamental characteristics that defined female anatomy. They had observed pregnant queens and aging dowagers, athletic young princesses and sedentary noblewomen. They understood the full spectrum of female physical variation within European royalty. And when they looked at Elizabeth, something didn't match the pattern. Something was fundamentally different in a way that transcended normal human variation, that went beyond the expected differences between tall and short, athletic and sedentary, healthy and sickly. What they observed wasn't just unusual, it was anatomically wrong in a way that suggested Elizabeth's body didn't conform to female structure at all. The Spanish weren't the only ones noticing something fundamentally different about England's queen, something that set her apart from every other woman in European royalty. The Venetian ambassador, another highly trained professional, whose entire job was assessing European royalty with ruthless accuracy, sent back reports that were remarkably similar in their confusion and concern. He noted that Elizabeth possessed an unusually masculine form, and that her physical presence was unlike the other queens and princesses of Christendom. His reports went into elaborate detail about how she moved, how she carried herself, how her body was structured beneath the elaborate court dress. He noted the width of her shoulders, which he described as more suited to a soldier than a lady of royal birth. He commented on her narrow hips, which created what he called an inverted proportion most unusual in a woman. He observed her physical strength during hunting expeditions, noting that she could control a horse with ease that matched or exceeded male riders. These weren't isolated observations from biased enemies trying to undermine her legitimacy or spread malicious rumors about England's Protestant queen. French diplomats reported the same thing, using nearly identical language despite having no contact with Spanish or Venetian intelligence networks. They described her masculine bearing, her soldier-like posture, and her unusual proportions that suggest a form more military than feminine. German envoys wrote similar assessments, noting her unnatural height for a woman and the way her body seemed to contradict what they knew about female anatomy. Portuguese representatives observed identical characteristics, reporting back to Lisbon that the English queen's physical form was not as one expects in a woman of any rank or breeding. All of these men were professionals who had spent years, sometimes decades, at various European courts. They had observed Catherine de' Medici in France, a woman known for her commanding presence. They had seen Mary of Hungary in the Netherlands, who was tall and imposing. They had witnessed Isabella of Portugal and Spain, who was athletic and strong. They knew exactly what royal women looked like, how they carried themselves, how their bodies were proportioned beneath the elaborate court dress that was designed to enhance feminine curves and create an idealized silhouette. They had seen tall women, athletic women, commanding women. women who dominated their courts through force of personality and political cunning. But Elizabeth was different in a way they struggled to articulate without causing a major diplomatic incident that could damage relations between England and their respective nations. The most chilling aspect of these reports is what happened to the men who wrote them with too much detail or too much clarity about what they had observed. The Spanish diplomat who penned those 7 devastating words never worked in diplomacy again. Despite being considered one of Philip's most skilled negotiators and having successfully handled sensitive missions throughout Europe for over 15 years, his career ended abruptly and he spent the rest of his life in relative obscurity at a minor estate in rural Spain, never speaking publicly about his time in England. One of the Venetian ambassadors who wrote detailed observations about Elizabeth's masculine bearing and unusual physical structure died under mysterious circumstances shortly after returning to Venice. The official cause was listed as sudden fever, one of those conveniently vague diagnoses that explained nothing and ended all inquiry. But colleagues noted he had been in perfect health just days before, had shown no signs of illness, and the sickness came on with suspicious speed right after he had given a private briefing to the Doge about his observations of the English Queen. He had been preparing to write a comprehensive report about his years in England, including detailed observations about Elizabeth's physical characteristics and what they might suggest about her true nature. That report was never completed. His papers were seized by Venetian authorities immediately after his death and disappeared into state archives where they have never been found. A French envoy who had sent multiple encrypted dispatches describing her unusual physical form and proportions that suggest a nature contrary to her sex was found dead in his chambers under circumstances that were never properly explained. The official ruling was heart attack, despite the fact that he was only 42 years old, in perfect health, an avid horseman who exercised daily, and had no family history of heart problems. His personal physician expressed shock at the diagnosis, noting that he had examined the envoy just days before and found him in excellent condition. But the physician's objections were quietly ignored, and the matter was closed with suspicious speed. These weren't random tragedies or unfortunate coincidences. These were men who had seen too much, written too much, understood too much about what Elizabeth's elaborate costumes were hiding beneath layers of fabric and structured undergarments. And someone with significant power and reach wanted to make absolutely certain their observations didn't spread beyond encrypted diplomatic channels, that their insights didn't reach the general public or inspire others to look more closely at England's queen. But if her unusual form troubled these trained observers, her height made it impossible to ignore that something was fundamentally different. When Elizabeth entered a room, she didn't just command attention through her status as queen or the elaborate costume that announced her rank. She physically dominated the space in a way that shocked everyone who witnessed it, creating an immediate visual impact that was impossible to ignore or explain away. In an era when the average English woman stood barely 5 feet tall, when even noble women with access to superior nutrition rarely exceeded 5 feet 2 inches, when a woman of 5 feet 4 inches would have been considered remarkably tall, Elizabeth towered. She matched the height of her male courtiers, standing eye to eye with men who were considered tall for their time, men who were accustomed to looking down at women when they spoke. Foreign ambassadors consistently noted this in their reports, often with barely concealed confusion and sometimes with language that suggested they found it deeply unsettling. One Spanish observer wrote that Her Majesty stands as tall as the men of her council, which creates a most unusual sight that defies the natural order. Another diplomat noted that when Elizabeth walked through her court, she was often the tallest person in the room, including the men, creating a visual dynamic that was contrary to all expectation and natural law regarding the stature of women. A French envoy commented that standing near the queen was a disorienting experience, as one expects to look down upon a lady, yet finds oneself meeting her eyes at level height. This wasn't a subtle difference that required careful observation to notice. This was a stark, immediately noticeable physical reality that couldn't be hidden or explained away by clever costuming or strategic positioning. Every time Elizabeth entered a space, her height announced itself before anything else about her could be processed. In a society where gender roles were rigidly defined and physical differences between men and women were considered not just natural but divinely ordained, where the very structure of society depended on clear distinctions between male and female bodies, Elizabeth's height was deeply unsettling to everyone who encountered her. It wasn't just unusual or noteworthy, it was wrong in a way that suggested her body didn't follow the rules that governed other women's bodies. Understanding just how unusual this was requires grasping the context of Tudor England. and the stark physical differences that existed between men and women in the 16th century. Women weren't just shorter on average by a few inches, they were dramatically shorter in ways that modern people struggle to comprehend. The skeletal remains of Tudor-era women recovered from archaeological excavations paint a clear picture. The average height was around 4 feet 11 inches, with noblewomen who had access to better nutrition reaching perhaps 5 feet 1 or 2 inches at most. A woman of 5 feet 4 inches would have been considered freakishly tall, a subject of comment and curiosity. Elizabeth stood somewhere between 5 feet 8 and 5 feet 10 inches, based on contemporary descriptions, making her not just tall, but extraordinarily, impossibly tall by the standards of her era. To put this in perspective, she would have been taller than roughly 95% of all women in England, and taller than a significant percentage of men as well. When she walked through the streets of London on royal processions, the visual impact would have been stunning. Crowds of people would have seen a figure who towered above the women around her, who matched or exceeded the height of male guards and courtiers. This wasn't something that went unnoticed or unremarked upon. Contemporary accounts from public events consistently mention her extraordinary height, often with language that suggests people found it unsettling or contrary to nature. One observer at her coronation procession noted that Her Majesty appeared as a giant among her ladies, standing head and shoulders above them in a manner most strange to behold. Another account from a royal progress through the countryside described how the Queen's great height caused much comment among the common people, who marveled that a woman could stand so tall. But her height was merely the most obvious characteristic that suggested her body was structured differently than other women's bodies. It was what that height implied about the rest of her physical structure that truly troubled informed observers who understood anatomy. Height doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to overall skeletal structure, to the proportions of limbs and torso, to the width of shoulders and the structure of the ribcage. A tall woman typically has longer legs, a longer torso, and yes, broader shoulders than a shorter woman, but the proportions remain fundamentally female. The ratio of shoulder width to hip width stays consistent, maintaining what is recognized as a female silhouette. But multiple observers noted that Elizabeth's proportions were different. Her shoulders were described as unusually broad, not just for a woman of any height, but broad in a way that seemed disproportionate even given her exceptional stature. Venetian reports specifically noted that her shoulder width seemed to exceed what would be expected even for a very tall woman, creating what one observer called a martial bearing, more suited to a soldier in armor than a queen in silk. When she wore the elaborate dresses of her era, with their wide sleeves and structured shoulders, the effect was to create an even more imposing silhouette. But observers with trained eyes could see that the clothing wasn't creating the width, it was merely emphasizing what was already there. The structured undergarments that all noblewomen wore were designed to enhance feminine curves, to create the ideal silhouette of narrow shoulders, cinched waist, and wide hips. On Elizabeth, these garments seemed to be fighting against her natural structure rather than enhancing it. Court painters who were commissioned to create her portraits faced an ongoing challenge. They were expected to depict her as the ideal of feminine beauty, but they had to reconcile that expectation with the reality of the body before them. Many of Elizabeth's portraits show her in poses that minimize her shoulder width, that use strategic positioning of arms and elaborate sleeve design to distract from her broad upper body. Some paintings appear to have literally reduced her shoulder width, creating a form that was more in line with expectations about how a queen should look, but that didn't match what observers saw in person. And if her shoulders troubled observers, what they noticed about her hips was even more telling. The female body, regardless of height or overall build, maintains certain proportions that are fundamentally characteristic of female anatomy. Wide hips relative to shoulders is one of the most defining features, created by the structure of the pelvis, which is shaped differently in women to accommodate childbirth. This isn't subtle, it's a dramatic structural difference that creates the classic hourglass or pear-shaped silhouette that defines the female form. Tudor fashion was specifically designed to emphasize and celebrate this feature. The elaborate skirts that spread wide from the waist, the structured farthingales that created exaggerated hip width. All of this was meant to showcase the most obviously feminine aspect of a woman's body. But on Elizabeth, something was wrong. Multiple observers trained to notice such things commented that beneath the elaborate costume, her hips appeared uncommonly narrow, or insufficient to balance her considerable height and shoulder width. One particularly astute Venetian ambassador who had spent years studying the human form through his patronage of artists and his own amateur interest in anatomy, wrote in a private letter that Her Majesty's form suggests an inverted triangle, with breadth at the shoulder diminishing to unexpected narrowness at the hip, creating a proportion I have observed in men of martial bearing, but never in a woman of any description. This observation is devastating in its implications. He's not saying she had narrow hips for a woman. He's saying she had the proportional structure of a male body, the inverted triangle shape that characterizes masculine anatomy. The elaborate costumes Elizabeth wore can now be seen in a different light. Those massive farthingales that made her skirts extend several feet in every direction weren't just fashion statements. They were architectural solutions to a structural problem, creating artificial hip width that her body didn't naturally possess. The layers upon layers of petticoats weren't just about maintaining royal dignity. They were about disguising the true shape of her lower body, hiding the narrow hips that would have immediately signaled to any observer that something was anatomically wrong. The silhouette that emerged from these combined features was clear to anyone with eyes to see and knowledge to understand what they were seeing. Broad shoulders, narrow hips, exceptional height, and a long torso created what multiple ambassadors described in coded language as a masculine form or a soldier's build. This wasn't about her being athletic or strong, qualities that could exist in women even if they were unusual. This was about fundamental body structure, about the skeletal framework that determined her overall shape, and that couldn't be changed by diet, exercise, or behavior. One of the most revealing comments came from a German physician who was part of a diplomatic envoy to Elizabeth's court. He never examined her personally, but he observed her at multiple court functions and wrote in his private journal observations that were clearly meant for his own medical interest rather than for any political purpose. He noted that the English queen presents a form that would perplex any student of anatomy. Her height alone would be remarkable in a woman, but it is the proportion of that height that troubles the scientific mind. The breadth of shoulder, the narrowness of hip, the length of limb and manner of walking all suggest a fundamental structure that differs from the female form as it is understood by medical science. He went on to speculate in language that was remarkably bold for the era that one must wonder if Her Majesty's form represents some rare condition of nature, or whether there is another explanation that would better account for these unusual characteristics. That last comment suggests he suspected something, that his medical training was telling him he was looking at a body that fundamentally didn't match the gender it was presenting. But he was wise enough not to state that conclusion explicitly, instead hiding his suspicions in vague language about another explanation. The pattern is consistent across dozens of independent observations from multiple countries over 44 years. These weren't people comparing notes or coordinating their descriptions. These were separate observers, trained professionals from different nations, different backgrounds, different motivations, all reporting the same basic observation. Elizabeth's body structure was masculine, and what makes this even more significant is what she did to hide it. Everything about Elizabeth's appearance was artificial, controlled, and deliberately concealing in ways that went far beyond normal Tudor fashion or royal vanity. From her 20s onward, she wore increasingly elaborate wigs that completely covered her natural hair, massive constructions that added nearly a foot to her height, and required structural support to stay in place. The official explanation was that she suffered from hair loss due to smallpox in 1562, a convenient medical excuse that explained her need for wigs. But some historians question whether she ever had smallpox at all, noting that the supposed scarring from the disease was never visible even when she removed her makeup, and that the illness provided a perfect excuse to begin wearing wigs that would hide her natural hairline. Male pattern baldness, particularly the receding hairline that affects men as they age, would have been impossible to hide without wigs. If Elizabeth was living as a woman but possessed a male body, hair loss would have followed male rather than female patterns, creating a hairline that would have immediately revealed the truth. The wigs solved this problem completely, covering not just the top of her head but extending down to her eyebrows, eliminating any chance that someone might notice a masculine hairline. These wigs became more extreme as she aged, towering constructions decorated with jewels, pearls, and elaborate ornaments that were architectural marvels in their own right. They were also incredibly heavy, requiring her to hold her head in careful balance and reportedly causing headaches that plagued her for days after wearing the most elaborate versions. Why would she subject herself to this discomfort if the wigs were merely fashion accessories? Unless they were essential to maintaining the illusion, to hiding a hairline that would have betrayed her secret the moment anyone saw her natural hair. Then there was the makeup, that famous white face that became her trademark and her curse. Tudor beauty standards demanded pale skin, and noble women across Europe used various cosmetics to achieve the desired complexion. But Elizabeth took it to extremes that poisoned her and eventually destroyed her face. She painted her face with Venetian ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar that created a porcelain mask of startling whiteness, but also slowly destroyed her skin and poisoned her bloodstream. By her 40s, the damage was becoming visible. Her skin was beginning to deteriorate, developing a texture that witnesses described as rough and damaged. By her 50s, the destruction was severe enough that the makeup could barely cover it. By her 60s, witnesses said her face looked like it was melting, with the skin literally peeling away in places where the lead had eaten through too many layers of tissue. She knew the makeup was destroying her. Her physicians warned her repeatedly about the dangers. They prescribed treatments to try to repair the damage, recommended she stop using the ceruse, begged her to find less toxic alternatives. She refused every suggestion, continuing to apply the poisonous paste every single day, no matter how much it hurt, no matter how much damage it caused. Why? The official explanation is vanity, that she was desperately trying to maintain an illusion of eternal youth. But there's another explanation that fits the evidence better. What if the makeup wasn't about beauty at all? What if she was hiding something beneath it? Male skin tends to be rougher, with larger pores and different texture than female skin. Male facial hair, even when shaved, creates a shadow beneath the skin that can be visible, particularly in strong light. If Elizabeth had male facial characteristics, the thick white makeup would have hidden them completely, creating a smooth, uniform surface that concealed any masculine texture or shadow. The fact that she was willing to destroy her face to poison herself slowly over decades suggests the makeup was serving a purpose more critical than vanity. It was hiding something that couldn't be revealed under any circumstances. And then there was the clothing. Those elaborate costumes that became increasingly extreme as her reign progressed. Elizabeth wore the highest collars, the most elaborate ruffs, the most concealing gowns of any monarch in history. Early in her reign, her clothing was elaborate, but not exceptional by royal standards. But as the years went by, her costumes became more and more architectural, more structural, more designed to disguise rather than reveal. The ruffs around her neck grew from modest collars to massive constructions that extended a foot in every direction, creating a barrier between her face and her body that made it impossible to see the line of her jaw, the structure of her neck, or the transition from head to shoulders. These ruffs were uncomfortable, requiring starch and wire supports to maintain their shape, restricting her movement and making eating nearly impossible while wearing them. Yet she insisted on wearing them constantly, even in private meetings where such formality was unnecessary. What was she hiding beneath them? The neck and throat are areas where masculine characteristics are particularly visible. Men typically have larger Adam's apples, more prominent throat structures, and different angles where the jaw meets the neck. A massive ruff would hide all of these features completely, making it impossible for observers to see anything about the structure of her throat or lower face. Her bodices were marvels of engineering, structured garments that didn't just support the body but actively reshaped it. They were built with wooden busks, metal stays, and layers of heavy fabric that created an artificial torso shape. These weren't designed to enhance a natural female figure. They were designed to create one where it might not exist naturally. The tight lacing compressed her waist, certainly, but the real engineering went into the chest and shoulder area, where carefully designed panels and padding could create the appearance of breasts while simultaneously minimizing shoulder width. The way these garments worked is fascinating from an engineering perspective. The bodice would start with a foundation layer that bound the chest flat, similar to what modern trans men use when binding. Then structural elements would be added, creating a new shape entirely. Padding could be strategically placed to create the illusion of breasts, carefully positioned to look natural under the outer layers of clothing. The shoulder area could be structured to make broad shoulders appear narrower, using diagonal panels that drew the eye inward rather than emphasizing width. The whole construction was then covered with elaborate outer layers decorated with jewels and embroidery that distracted the eye and made it impossible to discern what the actual body underneath looked like. Elizabeth's wardrobe accounts show hundreds of these structured bodices, each one custom-made, each one a new attempt to create the perfect illusion. She never appeared in public without one, never allowed herself to be seen in simple, unstructured clothing that would have revealed her natural form. Even in her private chambers, accounts suggest she remained partially dressed at all times, never allowing even her most trusted servants to see her completely unclothed. The few descriptions we have of her nightwear suggest it was elaborate and structured, not the simple shifts that most women wore to bed. She was maintaining the illusion even in sleep, even in the most private moments, because the truth beneath the costume could never be revealed. And beneath all of this, hidden under layers of fabric and structure, her body held the secret that all of this costume was designed to conceal. But her physical appearance was only part of the evidence. Her capabilities, her strength, her endurance, all pointed to a body that functioned differently than a female body should. Elizabeth's physical capabilities were legendary and consistently shocked observers who expected royal women to be delicate, fragile creatures who tired easily and required constant care. She could hunt on horseback for entire days, riding from dawn until dusk without showing signs of fatigue, outlasting men who were half her age and considered to be excellent riders themselves. These weren't casual rides through gardens. These were intense hunts across rough countryside, requiring exceptional upper body strength to control a horse at speed, core strength to maintain balance during rapid direction changes, and cardiovascular endurance that would challenge even experienced male riders. Multiple ambassadors noted this with clear surprise, writing comments like, "Her Majesty rides as well as any man in her court, and with greater stamina than most." One observer watched her hunt for 11 straight hours, maintaining control of her horse through difficult terrain, jumping obstacles, and keeping pace with the fastest riders in her party, then dismount and attend a council meeting as if she hadn't just spent the entire day in the saddle. This wasn't just unusual, it was physiologically significant. Women's bodies, due to differences in muscle mass distribution, cardiovascular capacity, and skeletal structure, typically don't perform these sustained physical activities at the level Elizabeth demonstrated. She wasn't just a strong woman or an athletic woman. She was performing at a level that matched or exceeded trained male riders. Her stamina extended beyond hunting into every aspect of her life. She could dance for hours at court celebrations, outlasting partners decades younger. She could stand for entire days during ceremonial occasions that would leave most people collapsing from exhaustion. During her famous progresses around England, traveling from estate to show herself to her people, she maintained a schedule that exhausted her entire court. She would ride for hours, then immediately engage in elaborate ceremonies, attend multiple meetings, dine at formal banquets, and often stay up late into the night working on correspondence or discussing policy with advisors. Her secretaries, all men and mostly young men selected for their energy and dedication, complained constantly about the pace she set. They wrote to each other about how they couldn't keep up with the Queen's energy, how she seemed to never tire, how she worked them to exhaustion while remaining fresh herself. William Cecil, her principal secretary and closest advisor, was 47 years old when Elizabeth became queen at 25. Over their 40-year working relationship, he aged into an old man while she seemed to maintain the same relentless energy level year after year. He wrote in personal letters about his inability to match her pace, about how meetings that would exhaust him seemed to invigorate her, about how she could work through the night and be fresh for more meetings in the morning, while he needed days to recover. This kind of endurance, particularly maintained year after year and decade after decade, suggests a physical capacity that goes beyond what female physiology typically allows. Women can certainly be athletic, strong, and energetic, but the sustained, extreme endurance Elizabeth displayed throughout her life, the ability to physically outlast younger men engaged in demanding activities, suggests a body built differently, with the muscle mass, cardiovascular capacity, and skeletal structure that characterizes male physiology. Then there were her hands, those revealing hands that she couldn't hide despite her best efforts. Multiple ambassadors and courtiers noted that Elizabeth had unusually large and powerful hands for a woman, often comparing them specifically to men's hands rather than to other women's. This wasn't a casual observation. In Tudor society, hands were incredibly important as indicators of breeding, status, and gender. Noble women were expected to have small, delicate hands with long, elegant fingers. Their hands were displayed prominently in portraiture, often positioned to show off their smallness and delicacy as proof of femininity and noble breeding. Working women had larger, rougher hands from labor, but even then, the bone structure remained female, with proportions that were distinctly different from male hands. Elizabeth's hands were large in ways that suggested male bone structure. They were broad across the palm, with long fingers that were thick rather than elegant. Contemporary accounts mention her strong grip, her ability to control horses with hands that possessed masculine strength. Portrait painters faced a constant challenge in depicting her hands, often painting them smaller than they actually were or positioning them in ways that minimized their size. In some portraits, her hands are hidden entirely or shown at angles that make their true proportions impossible to discern. She wore elaborate gloves whenever possible, often keeping them on even indoors when other nobles would have removed them. The gloves were decorated with jewels and embroidery, drawing attention to the accessories while hiding the size of the hands beneath. She wore massive rings that would have been difficult to wear on smaller fingers, rings that contemporary accounts specifically note were sized for a man's hand. When she had to remove her gloves for ceremonial purposes, observers consistently noted the size of her hands with surprise or discomfort. But perhaps nothing revealed her masculine structure more clearly than the way she moved through space. Walking, running, standing, sitting, these basic physical movements are governed by skeletal structure and center of gravity, and they differ distinctly between male and female bodies. Women with wider hips and different pelvic structure move in characteristic ways. The walk is different, with hips that naturally sway more due to the wider pelvis. The stride is typically shorter due to the angle at which the femur connects to the pelvis. The posture is different, with center of gravity that sits lower in the body. These aren't learned behaviors or cultural conditioning, they're biomechanical realities that stem directly from skeletal structure. Elizabeth moved like a man. Multiple trained observers noted this explicitly, using language that showed they recognized something fundamentally wrong with how she moved. One diplomat wrote that Her Majesty walks with long strides, more befitting a soldier than a lady of rank. Another noted that she crosses a room with masculine purpose, her gait entirely unlike that of her ladies who move with proper feminine delicacy. A French observer commented that watching her walk was a disorienting experience, as her height and stride create an impression of male-bearing despite her feminine costume. Her stride length was specifically noted multiple times. Tudor noblewomen took small steps, partly due to fashion and training, but also due to the biomechanical constraints of female hip structure. Elizabeth took long, ground-covering strides that required a narrower pelvis and different femur angle. When she walked through her court, she covered distance quickly, forcing her ladies to hurry to keep pace. One observer noted that Her Majesty's ladies must nearly run to attend her, as her natural pace exceeds their capacity. This wasn't about being in a hurry or about personality. This was about biomechanics, about a body that moved the way male bodies move because it was structured the way male bodies are structured. Her posture when standing was also noted as unusual. She stood with weight evenly distributed on both feet, with straight back and squared shoulders in what multiple observers described as a military bearing. Women of her era, due partly to fashion but also to biomechanical factors related to center of gravity, typically stood with weight on one hip, with posture that emphasized curves and maintained different balance points. Elizabeth stood like a soldier at attention, with the straight-backed posture that military training instilled in men. Even when sitting, observers noted differences. She sat with legs positioned differently than other women, with posture that suggested different hip socket angles. Tudor fashion required women to sit in specific ways that accommodated wide skirts and emphasized modest, controlled positioning. Elizabeth often sat in ways that seemed more natural to male anatomy, then had to correct herself or be corrected by horrified ladies-in-waiting who recognized the posture as inappropriate. All of these observations, taken individually, might be explained as quirks of personality or unusual physical characteristics within the normal range of female variation. But taken together, they paint a consistent picture that deeply troubled trained observers. These weren't people who had limited experience with human bodies or who were easily confused. These were professionals who had observed thousands of people across every rank of society and every nationality in Europe. They knew what male bodies looked like and how they moved. They knew what female bodies looked like and how they moved. And when they observed Elizabeth, everything about her physical form and movement patterns matched male characteristics despite the female costume she wore. But the most damning evidence of all came at the very end, when the costume finally had to come off. In 1603, Elizabeth I stopped breathing. She was 69 years old, ancient by the standards of her era, and her death had been anticipated for weeks. What happened next should have been routine. Royal bodies were prepared for burial according to established traditions, examined by physicians to confirm cause of death, witnessed by nobles to ensure proper handling, and then dressed in burial clothes and laid in state for the public to pay respects. The entire process was designed to be transparent, to prevent rumors, to document exactly what happened to the monarch's body. But none of that happened with Elizabeth. Instead, the moment she died, her counselors moved with extraordinary speed, as if executing a prearranged plan they had been preparing for years. The doors to her death chamber were locked immediately. Guards were posted with explicit orders that absolutely no one could enter or leave without direct permission from the Privy Council. Only 3 ladies-in-waiting, women who had served Elizabeth for decades, and who were bound to her by loyalty that transcended normal service, were allowed to remain inside. Even high-ranking nobles who had every right to witness the preparation were turned away by armed guards. The Duke of Suffolk, one of the most powerful men in England, demanded entry and was physically blocked by guards who told him they had orders that superseded his rank. The French ambassador, who by diplomatic protocol should have been allowed to verify the Queen's death, was turned away at the palace gates and told he would be informed when appropriate. Multiple nobles sent angry letters to the Privy Council, demanding to know why traditional protocols were being violated, why they were being excluded from proceedings they had every right to attend. Their protests were ignored. Behind those locked doors, the 3 ladies-in-waiting began the terrible task of undressing their queen's body. They started removing the elaborate layers that had hidden Elizabeth's body for 44 years, peeling away the costume that had maintained the illusion of female form through nearly half a century of rule. First came the jeweled gown, heavy with pearls and gold thread, so elaborate that it required careful handling just to lift it off. Then the multiple petticoats, layer after layer of fabric that had created the illusion of wide hips and feminine curves. Then the farthingale, that massive structured undergarment that had spread her skirts in all directions and hidden the true narrowness of her hips. With each layer removed, more of the truth was revealed. When they reached the corset, they found it had been laced so tightly for so many years that it had become almost part of her body. The lacing had to be cut away, and when it was finally removed, they discovered deep, permanent grooves across her entire torso, where the boning had pressed into her flesh for decades. Her ribs were visibly misshapen, some cracked and healed improperly from constant pressure. The corset had been doing more than just cinching her waist. It had been actively reshaping her torso, compressing her chest, creating an artificial silhouette that bore little resemblance to what lay underneath. When they removed the white makeup, it came away in sheets, literally peeling off and taking skin with it. Decades of lead-based cosmetics had eaten through her flesh like acid, creating wounds that looked like burns. One lady-in-waiting vomited at the sight of the Queen's damaged face and had to be escorted from the room. She was immediately sent to a remote estate with a generous pension and explicit, terrifying instructions never to speak of what she had witnessed. The other 2 women continued their work in silence, their faces pale, their hands shaking. They were uncovering something that went beyond the expected horrors of death and decay, something that explained why such extreme security had been put in place. When they removed the final layers, when there was nothing left to hide behind, they found what all those observers had suspected for 44 years. The accounts that survived use euphemistic language, coded phrases that hint at the truth without stating it explicitly. One fragmentary document refers to something being not as it should be. Another mentions discovering that which should be absent yet was present, and that which should be present yet was absent. A third account, discovered in Spanish archives centuries later, uses even more carefully coded language, stating only that the truth of Her Majesty's form was revealed to be a certain Spanish intelligence had reported many years prior. What they found was a body that didn't match the gender Elizabeth had presented to the world for nearly 70 years. Whether she was born with a condition that made her body develop along male lines, or whether she was indeed the Bisley boy living out the desperate deception that began in 1544, the result was the same. The body in that death chamber was fundamentally masculine in structure. The broad shoulders that costume had tried to minimize, the narrow hips that farthingales had disguised, the skeletal structure that had created that masculine stride and military bearing, all of it was revealed when the costume was finally removed. And possibly more than structure, possibly actual male anatomy that explained why marriage had been impossible, why no doctor could be allowed to examine her thoroughly, why Spanish intelligence had reported with certainty that she would never bear children. Within hours of this discovery, Elizabeth's body was wrapped in treated cloth and sealed inside a lead coffin that was soldered shut before rigor mortis had fully set in. This was unprecedented speed. Royal bodies normally lay prepared for days, allowing time for the death to be properly documented, for nobles to pay respects, for physicians to complete examinations. Elizabeth's body was sealed within hours, as if every second it remained visible was dangerous. The 3 servants who had witnessed the preparation were separated immediately. They were sent to different parts of England, to remote estates far from London and from each other, with generous pensions that ensured their silence. But the payments came with explicit threats. They were told in no uncertain terms that speaking about what they had seen would result in execution, not just for themselves, but for their families. These weren't idle threats. The Tudor state had demonstrated repeatedly its willingness to execute anyone who posed a threat to stability or spread dangerous information. These women had seen something that could destroy the legitimacy of Elizabeth's entire reign, that could throw England into chaos by suggesting its greatest monarch had been living a lie. They were given wealth and comfort in exchange for eternal silence, backed by the absolute certainty that breaking that silence would mean death. And they kept silent. Not one of them ever spoke publicly about what they had witnessed in that death chamber. Their descendants, if they passed the story down through family lines, never made it public. The secret they carried went to their graves with them. Meanwhile, the doctors who had attended Elizabeth during her final illness began dying under suspicious circumstances. 3 physicians, all relatively young and healthy men, all died within a year of Elizabeth's death. The causes were conveniently vague: sudden fever, fall downstairs resulting in broken neck, apoplexy. These weren't elderly men at the end of natural lives. These were experienced physicians in the prime of their careers, men who might have written memoirs, who might have shared observations with colleagues, who might have revealed something about Elizabeth's true physical condition based on their examinations during her final illness. One of them was known to be keeping detailed medical notes about his royal patients, a common practice among physicians of the era. Those notes were never found. His residence was searched thoroughly after his death, his papers were examined, but the medical journals everyone knew he kept had vanished completely. But the most telling detail about the cover-up is what happened with the tomb itself. Elizabeth's body was initially placed in a vault at Westminster Abbey, sealed away from public view. Then in 1606, just 3 years after her death, King James I ordered her remains moved to a new location, where they would share a tomb with her half-sister Mary I. This might seem like a gesture of reconciliation between the Catholic Mary and Protestant Elizabeth, a symbolic healing of religious divisions. But it served another purpose. It provided an excuse to move Elizabeth's coffin, to place it in a location that was even more secure, even more thoroughly sealed, where any future attempt to examine it would be more difficult. James issued explicit orders that the tomb was never to be disturbed, never opened, never examined under any circumstances. This is remarkable because James had every reason to diminish Elizabeth's memory and legacy. Elizabeth had imprisoned his mother, Mary Queen of Scots, for 19 years. Elizabeth had signed the execution warrant that resulted in his mother's beheading. James should have hated Elizabeth, should have wanted to tear down her legacy, should have been eager to uncover any scandal that might reduce her historical reputation. Instead, he became the most zealous protector of her tomb and her secrets. Why? The only logical explanation is that someone told him what was discovered when they undressed Elizabeth's corpse. Someone in Elizabeth's inner circle, someone who had witnessed the truth, briefed the new king and explained exactly why that tomb could never be opened. James understood immediately that revealing Elizabeth's true nature would call into question his own legitimacy. If Elizabeth had been living a lie, if her reign had been based on deception, the entire Tudor succession could be questioned. James's own claim to the English throne depended on the legitimacy of the Tudor line and the legal transition of power. Exposing Elizabeth's secret would throw all of that into doubt. For over 400 years, the British establishment has maintained that protection with remarkable consistency. Every other English monarch of significance has been studied, examined, even exhumed for historical and scientific purposes. In 2012, researchers literally dug up Richard III from under a parking lot and subjected his skeleton to comprehensive DNA testing, CT scans, facial reconstruction, and detailed analysis that revealed everything from his diet to his battle wounds. Henry VII's tomb was opened multiple times. Medieval kings have been examined. Ancient Egyptian pharaohs have been unwrapped and genetically analyzed. Modern technology allows us to examine remains without even opening coffins, using ground-penetrating radar, CT scanning, and other non-invasive techniques that can reveal skeletal structure and even DNA evidence without disturbing the burial. But every single request to examine Elizabeth has been denied. In 1952, historians petitioned to examine her remains during the coronation of Elizabeth II, arguing that it would be a fitting tribute to compare the two great queens. Denied. In 1975, when new non-invasive technology became available that could scan through the coffin without opening it, another request was made, denied. In 2003, on the 400th anniversary of her death, researchers proposed using the most advanced scanning technology available with promises of absolute discretion and state-of-the-art preservation techniques. Denied again. The official reason is always respect for the dead. But that excuse rings hollow when you realize they've opened every other royal tomb without such concerns. Westminster Abbey has allowed examination of dozens of historical burials. The British Museum regularly works with remains far more ancient than Elizabeth's. The excuse of respecting the dead is applied uniquely and exclusively to Elizabeth, suggesting it's not about respect at all, but about protecting a secret that the establishment has decided must remain buried forever. So, what was Elizabeth hiding beneath 44 years of elaborate costume? What secret was so dangerous that her body was sealed within hours of death? What truth is still being protected 400 years later? The evidence all points to the same conclusion that troubled those trained observers 4 centuries ago. Elizabeth's body was fundamentally masculine in structure, with broad shoulders, narrow hips, exceptional height, large hands, and physical capabilities that matched male physiology. Whether she was born with a rare condition that caused her body to develop along male lines despite being chromosomally female, or whether she was indeed the Bisley boy living out a desperate deception that began in 1544 when a princess died and was replaced by a red-haired village child, the result was the same. The person who ruled England through its greatest age, who defeated the Spanish Armada, who established England as a world power, who gave her name to an entire era, was presenting as a woman while possessing a body that was structurally and possibly anatomically male. That's why she never married, despite decades of pressure and proposals from every powerful man in Europe. That's why Spanish intelligence reported with certainty that she would never bear children. That's why Robert Dudley, the love of her life, could never become her husband despite their obvious devotion. That's why she forbade examination of her body, and why that order was carried out with such extreme measures. And that's why her tomb remains sealed to this day, protected by the British establishment who understand that opening it would force a revelation that would rewrite history. If you're shocked by this evidence, if this has completely changed how you understand one of history's most famous figures, then hit that subscribe button right now. We're uncovering the secrets that history books refuse to acknowledge, revealing the truths that have been buried for centuries. Drop a comment below with your theory. Do you think Elizabeth was born with a condition that gave her a masculine body? Or do you believe the Bisley boy legend is true? And hit that like button if you think it's finally time for modern science to examine that sealed coffin and reveal the truth after 400 years of silence. The Virgin Queen's greatest secret has been protected long enough. It's time for the truth to finally come out.